Good morning. My name is Nathan. I'm one of the pastors here, and I am glad that you're here with us. If this is your first time, if you've been with us for months, we hope that you feel safe and welcome here. We are a group of people from all different walks of life learning together. What does it look like to follow Jesus? How do we do that together? And so none of us have all of the answers, but we are learning together. And so as Boone mentioned earlier, we are in a series for May. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And we are doing a series called Faith and Mental Health. And there's a few reasons that we believe this is important. A few things we want to name each week is one, that God cares about each of us holistically. He cares about you spiritually, emotionally, physically, all of those things. And in fact, our spiritual maturity is often connected to our emotional health and awareness. Second thing is we want to talk about this because too often the church has over-spiritualized mental health issues. We've given simplified answers to complex realities, and we want to name that God's grace is wide enough to handle nuance. God's grace is big enough to deal with gray areas. And the third thing is that this is a massive need. Whether this is yourself, your family, your friends, we are in the midst of a mental health crisis. We are stressed, anxious, lonely, depressed, burnt out, disconnected, confused, hurting, addicted, and we need Jesus to show us wisdom and grace in the midst of it. Amen. So we hope, we can only scratch the surface, but we hope that this is the start of a larger conversation. We hope that this is a conversation we can have amongst each other, amongst our families, to pursue healing and wholeness together. And so today, we're going to be talking about engaging with our past, especially talking about family. If you know me, I almost called Boone this week and said, man, we need to switch because I'm about to preach about family and my parents are a part of this family. I was like, there's no way this can end well. But the Lord was showing me throughout this week that I need to be willing to do the work too. That these words are just as much for me as they are for you. And so I want to start with a caveat. I can only scratch the surface. Some of what's going to come up will need to be continued to work out between you and God, between you and trusted friends or families, or just between you and yourself in a journal. Because whenever we talk about our past, whenever we talk about where we come from, that can be a source of a lot of pain. And there's a lot that might be said that even talking about this topic might bring up that's hard or painful. And so I want you to know, talking about this, my intention isn't to harm, it isn't to trigger, but it's to help us learn together how do we seek Jesus' healing in the deepest pains of our past. How do we seek Jesus' grace in the midst of our past? So, to start, why talk about the past? For you and for me, our past, and especially our families of origin, are one of the greatest shapers of who we are. And I didn't always believe this. I remember one of the first times that I talked to a counselor. If you talk to a counselor, one of the first things they'll ask you about is your family. And they'll be like, why am I talking about my family? This isn't the issue I'm bringing up. Why do you think they're related? But one of the first times I talked with a counselor, and he asked me to tell my story. I told a story, big events in my life, things that shaped me. And the thing he said at the end, the first thing he said was, you barely mentioned your family. And I had to think about that. And I've had to continue to think about that. Because if I'm honest, part of it was because I wanted my life to be shaped mostly by things I was in control of, or at least things that I remembered and was aware of. And yet, the truth is, it is a much bigger story than that. And as I continued to navigate friendships and relationships and marriage and life, I realized I was quite mistaken. And my family had shaped me far more than I realized, both for good and for ill. I love this quote from psychiatrist Kurt Thompson. He says, "It may be revealing to know that telling your story begins with someone else. Long before you arrive on the scene, before and after you were conceived, people started talking about you. They talked about your gender, what you'll be named, who they hope you will resemble in appearance and character, and who they hope you will not resemble. And even before this, perhaps your parents or others spent months or years longing for you, or perhaps no one longed for you. And you were eventually passed on to someone else for your care. We're all born out of backstories of beauty and tragedy, each of us with our own ratio of both. And your life begins out of and into this narrative that's already being told. So there's a lot that goes on even before we're born that shapes us. And one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite pastors sums this up well. Rich Villodas, he says, "Jesus may live in your heart, but Grandpa lives in your bones." Which means Jesus has the power to transform and be present in our lives, but if we don't name and talk about where we come from, there are things shaping us that we won't be aware of. So the truth is, we all have pain or dysfunction in our past that shapes us in the present. We all have that. And so the question we're going to be talking about today is, what are healthy ways to engage with our past? What are healthy ways to engage with our past? And so some backstory before we dive in today. We're going to be talking about Joseph. Joseph is in the book of Genesis, and there's a few big things to keep in mind. When Joseph comes on the scene, he's a part of a larger family that the Bible's been talking about, and there's dysfunction that clearly exists in his family. So there's generational patterns of lying, of favoritism, of fighting amongst brothers that exist in his parents, in his grandparents, and his great-grandparents. And so Joseph then comes onto the scene, and he is young and prideful. And to continue the generational pattern, he's his father's favorite. And if you've ever been a favorite kid, sometimes you might live into that a little foolishly, which is what Joseph did. And as a young man, he's betrayed by his brothers. He's sold into slavery. And his brothers tell his dad that he's dead. So here we have the most pivotal moment of his life, shaped by the favoritism, the lying, and the fighting that's been a part of his family. So then he's a slave. He experiences a wrongful conviction of sexual assault and is put in prison for a decade before coming to where he's at in the story now. After a turn of fate and the Lord's grace, he's now in a position of power in Egypt. But he's been through the ringer in his life. He has had a tough journey. He's got a struggle story. And so now his brothers are coming to him because there's a famine in the land and he's in a position of authority. And they don't know who he is, but they need food. And so we're going to pick up the story in Genesis 45, verses 1 through 8. Joseph's been talking with them, and it says, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, 'Make everyone go out from me.'" There's been plenty of people there, helpers, servants, and he says, "So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it and the household of Pharaoh heard it." He had an ugly cry you could hear 3 rooms over. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him. They were shocked. They were probably worried, for they were dismayed at his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into slavery. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Please pray with me. Lord, as we talk about our past, as we talk about family, I know there's hesitation in myself, so I imagine there's hesitation and nervousness present here. I pray, Lord, that your grace would enter into the wounds that we carry, into the scars that we have, into the places where we long for your grace to transform and heal us. Do that work in us today. We need it, Father. Amen. So what are healthy ways to engage with our past? The first thing I'm going to say that we see in Joseph's story is that he grieves and names the sin and dysfunction. Joseph is a man who was at a young age, was taken advantage of, was sold into slavery, and spent 10 years unjustly in prison. And now his brothers are there needing his help. And if we come from a rough family, maybe this is the moment we've all wanted, where we get to say how far we made it in spite of what people did to us. Where we get to rub it in their face and finally use the power we wish we had earlier to lord it over them. And the first thing Joseph does is that God gives him strength to name and grieve the sin and dysfunction. So first he grieves it. 13 years later, Joseph is still attached to the pain of his story. We're told multiple times that he weeps. In verse 2, we're told he weeps so loud that they hear him in another room. He grieves the pain that's been caused him, and he weeps over the brokenness that's in his family. He's connected to it, and he grieves it because it is wrong. He still feels the weight of the wrong that's done. And the second thing he does is he names it. He doesn't sugarcoat things with his brothers. He doesn't beat around the bush and say, remember that time I got lost? He names honestly, I am your brother whom you sold into Egypt. Joseph's not afraid to name the sin and dysfunction there. And in doing so, he's also naming the pattern that existed within his larger family of fighting, of lying, of favoritism. He's bringing to light that which was hidden. And the truth is, to be healthy in the present, we have to go back to our past. Even, and may I say, especially the sources of pain and hurt, because they shape us to this day. Unlike Joseph, we may not need to do this directly to the person, but we do need to do it for ourselves. Grieve the wrong that has been done to you. The patterns you experienced, the things you witnessed, perhaps at too young an age, the unhealth you were exposed to, the things you lost too early as a child. And we're invited to weep over those things and name the sin and dysfunction that was there. We have to face it to heal from it, because when we neglect the scars that we carry, we renew the wounds that inflicted them. When we neglect our scars, the wounds fester. And so we must grieve and name the sin and dysfunction in our past. One of the thinkers and writers we quote a lot here, her name's Christina Edmondson. When she's talking about naming difficult things, she said, there is enough grace to tell the truth. There's enough grace for those that have done wrong and experienced wrong, for truth to be named. So we have to enter into that. I quoted her husband last week, but Jackie Hill Perry said, beautiful is the spine that remembers where it came from. Beautiful is the spine that remembers where it came from. We must remember where we come from and name it. And yet you may ask, this is the exact reason why I don't want to do this, is because it's too painful. So we'll ask again, what are healthy ways to engage with our past? And I think the next thing we see from Joseph's story is we look for God's hand at work. Where is there healing? Well, from Joseph, we're invited into an opportunity for health, looking for God's hand at work. The past 13 years, they'd held so much pain for Joseph. The natural thing for me, the natural thing for him would have been to blame his brothers for all the pain and praise himself for all he'd done to get out of it. Yet he does something different. He gives God the credit and looks for him to be at work in both the good and the bad. And I believe this is because Joseph has been spending years dealing with his past and clinging to God in the midst of it, to come to a moment where he can say what he does in verse 6. He names what's been done, and then he says, do not be distressed or angry, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Lest we think it's an accident, in verse 7 he says, God sent me before you to preserve. In verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. It sounds crazy. And yet this is not a dismissal of his pain, because we saw him weep. And this is 13 years later. But it's a willingness for him to look at how God is at work, even in the sources of deepest pain and dysfunction. Joseph probably wouldn't have said this 1 year after his brothers sold him. He needed time, 13 years of soul work, relational work, and time with God in the crucible of suffering for him to now have eyes to better understand what he's been through and how God has been bringing redemption and healing in the midst of his suffering. The life he is able to bring to others helps him see it as worth it. His engagement with his past has helped him not just to be better for himself, not just to be healthier for him, but for his family and for the sake of the whole nation. Because he's now in a position to use his leadership for good. The way God brought him there was not accidental. And he says, this is for the sake of myself, my family, and others. There's a quote or a phrase that we often use. We might not know its background, but we'll often, when we talk about the strangeness of life, we can say, God works in mysterious ways. And there's actually a hymn that comes from, called God Moves in a Mysterious Way, by a guy named William Cowper. I know it looks like Cowper, but I promise it's how you spell it. William Cowper. He was a hymn writer in England, and he is someone that struggled with depression his whole life. Before he came to know the Lord, he had a couple suicide attempts, and he had some after he came to know Jesus too. He was constantly struggling with a heaviness that I would say was not just situational, but was biological and chemical. But he was somebody who spent a lot of time writing, especially hymns. And he wrote one time, God moves in a mysterious way after coming out of one of his long depressive spells. And I love this line from it. He says, judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. Behind a frowning providence, behind what looks painful and hard and as though God is frowning towards us, God is hiding a smiling face. And this is not somebody writing this who hasn't experienced pain and darkness, but it's his very darkness that's allowing him to write these words. So we too are invited to see God's hand at work. So what does this mean for us? Each week we try to leave with some things and opportunities we have to apply what we've heard. And this isn't a list of commands. This isn't going to make you better in God's eyes or better in our eyes. This is an opportunity to say, how do I bring this home for myself? And so the first thing I think we can do is reflect on your family and where you came from. I don't know what that might look like for you to start. Maybe it's just taking a couple minutes and writing about some memories you have from your childhood. Maybe a good one and a bad one. But we have to go back to go forward. And one thing that you could do is name, just like Joseph was a part of patterns that long preceded him, maybe you could name what are some generational sins or patterns that you find yourself a part of. That if you look behind you in the family tree, and for those who are old enough to look below in the family tree, what is there? What are patterns? Because the more that they're present, the easier they are to pass on. And the more likely they are to. So where do you see that? Maybe it's a pattern of infidelity, or addiction, or emotional distance. Maybe it's children out of wedlock. Maybe it's abuse. But name what are some of the patterns that you notice so you can be more aware for yourself where that comes from and how to more healthfully engage with those around you. The next thing I think we can do is both what Joseph does is grieve and name. For some of us, we can name things about our past, but we can't grieve what was done. I know for myself it's easy to be emotionally disconnected from events in my past. So I can name what happened, but I can't weep over the wrong that was done. So for some of you, that might be asking God this week for strength to grieve and going to him with your tears. Others of us maybe feel a heaviness and a sorrow when looking at our past, but we can't name the sin and dysfunction that took place. Today, name it to yourself, to God, and then maybe to a trusted friend. Start by having conversations. For me, I was talking about how God was doing work in my life. And part of that was realizing I'd been able to name things for myself, but I hadn't pursued the next level of health for me, which was talking with my parents about things. So they'll tell you, I texted them earlier in the week because I knew if I waited, I'd probably come up with a whole bunch of excuses. And we hopped on a call, and I said, hey, I want to talk about some things. I want to take another step in naming things that I experienced so we can be healthier all together. And so I can be healthier for my son, for my wife, for my friends, and for my community. So some of you might be needing to name that. The next thing I think we're all invited to do is to ask for help. Some of us struggle with that. There's a commercial Boone actually sent me a week ago for BetterHelp. And it's a guy, he's in the gym, and suddenly you hear this grunting. And there's a guy that's got like 300 pounds on the bench press on his chest. And the guy comes over to help him, and he's like, can I help you? And he's like, nah, man, you don't know my family. You don't know where I come from. I'll be fine. I just need a little bit of time. I'll figure it out myself. And it ends with, sometimes you just need some help. So whenever we do work like this, whenever we're seeking to navigate life healthier, sometimes we just need to ask for help. Don't go through this alone. Reach out to Boone, reach out to myself or one of our leaders, reach out to a counselor, talk with Jonathan for yourself or for a friend or family member that you know is going through a hard time. We need each other for this journey. And if you're going to enter into this, don't open up something if you don't have support around you to help you walk through it. Make sure you have somebody by your side. And the last thing I think we are called to do is to lean on God in all of this. This is heavy work. It's hard to face our past. It's hard to name and to grieve. Lean on God and let God define your past. Not your family, not your trauma, not your mistakes or mistakes done against you. But say, God, will you help define who I am and who I'm becoming? And so as I close today, maybe you are here and you're feeling a heaviness because your family has defined you or walked with you in ways you didn't know. I was reading a statistic earlier today from Marriage and Family Therapy that 80% of relationship conflicts are based on things that happened before the couple even met. And so whether you like it or not, your mom and your dad or your brother and your sister, they're in the room with you and your significant other when you have a fight. And so maybe you're here feeling a heaviness. There's parts of your family story that chase you and you can't seem to get away. You don't know how things could be different. And the beautiful thing about the gospel, the beautiful thing is that through Jesus, we're invited into a new family. We get to be shaped and formed towards a different direction. One towards wholeness and healing found in Jesus. And I've been reflecting on this line from Psalm 67 as it pertains to this. The psalmist cries out, "For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in."